Thank you. All right, good afternoon and welcome to the Acreage and Grain Stocks briefings. My name is Joe Parsons. I serve as chair of the Agricultural Statistics Board here at NASS. And this briefing is for the Secretary of Agriculture and other policymakers at USDA to better understand the content and context of today's reports. We're very pleased to have Deputy Undersecretary Gloria Montano Green of the Farm Production and Conservation Mission area with us today as our Secretary Designate. And also, we're very pleased to have Dr. Seth Meyer, USDA's Chief Economist. Great to have you both. Secretary Green, I would like to share with you that Kara Hagemeister, Aaron Cosgrove, and Julie Irwin of our regional field offices each provided valuable assistance on the preparation of these reports. Thanks to each of them for their help and counsel in reviewing all of the data. We're also really pleased to have Dr. Mark Ray, the Honorable Mark Ray, and the Dimmer Scholars with us, as well as many interns from across the research, economics, and education mission area. I'm glad that you could all join us today. I have a few notes for our live streaming audience. The Acreage and Grain Stocks reports are principal federal economic indicator reports. The Office of Management and Budget provides specific guidance on how these important reports are to be released. OMB statistical policy instructs policymaking officials to refrain from making public comment regarding the content of the reports within 1 hour of their release. Therefore, we will not be taking questions during this briefing from the public. However, NASS staff are available for email or phone questions, and we will host a social media event 1 hour after the release of these data. We strive to have everything presented in this briefing match the official record. However, should there be any discrepancy between what is presented at this briefing and the published estimates, always refer to the official published estimates. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Lance Honig, Chief of the NASS Crops Branch, as I think he has at least 1 or 2 slides to share with us today. Lance?
All right, thank you, Joe. There we go. All right, good afternoon. Also like to welcome everybody here. Appreciate all the guests here as well as all those tuning in online. And Joe, you're right. I do have maybe a couple more than 1 or 2 slides to share today. We have really got a lot of information between the acreage, grain stocks, and rice stocks reports all being released today. That translates to a lot of data and therefore a lot of slides. So I'm going to jump right in. Because I do have so much information, I will move fairly quickly through here, but obviously we'll have an opportunity for some questions at the end. If either of you have any of those for us today. So first off, just wanted to talk a little bit about the survey work that we did in preparing for these reports. Really 3 major survey efforts that we conducted. First, our June Ag survey. This is the farmer-driven survey. You can see nearly 64,000 farmers were contacted from May 30th through June 15th. Similar time frame as our June area survey. So rather than sampling farmers, we sample segments of land. In fact, you can see more than 9,000 of those segments of land. We enumerate every acre of land within the boundaries of those segments. It translates to just over 30,500 what we would call ag tracts, which essentially means that many more operators that we're in contact with. And so all told, really more than 90,000 producers that we're reaching out to specifically for the acreage and on-farm storage portion of our estimates. And then for the off-farm portion of the grain stocks report, of course, we need to contact those commercial facilities. There's about 8,200 of those across the country. And you can see the collection time frame very similar for all 3 of those efforts. At the bottom of the screen for the June Ag survey, the farmer-driven portion, you can see the sample sizes, how they're distributed across the country. Larger sample sizes are darker orange. Smaller sample sizes lighter, so you can get a visual of kind of how those are distributed across the country. This next map shows you how those area segments are distributed across the country. Again, same color pattern. And in general, you'll see the same areas having the larger samples because we're focusing in on the major crop producing areas in general. Just very quickly, each year in June for the last several years, we've highlighted up front the number of acres based on the survey work that we did were still left to be planted for corn and soybeans. It's a pretty minor amount this year, so not a big story here, but we like to highlight it each year before we get into the numbers. So again, based on the folks that reported to us on the survey, about 2.49 million acres of corn, 8.22 million acres of soybeans. But of course, with the weather the way it was this year, even those acres were probably not in jeopardy of not getting planted. So very complete information from our surveys this time. Before we look at the individual crops, I always like to start things off in June with the principal crops. That gives us that big picture look of what's happening across all the crops. And of course, for us, that's simply the sum of the 22 major crops planted across the U.S. The blue box at the bottom of the slide enumerates those 22 crops. But as you can see, based on our latest estimates, 318.7 million acres expected, I should say planted and expected to be planted. For those 22 crops, that's up just 0.2% or 600,000 acres from what we estimated back in March. Overall, it is up 2.1% or 6.6 million acres from what was planted to those same crops a year earlier. Just to put a little bit more perspective around that, next you can kind of see how those principal crop acres compare over some recent seasons there. You see the sharp increase from last year. In fact, we're looking at the largest total since 2018. And a lot of times we kind of compare back to that 2018 and earlier time frame. And you can see this puts us pretty much back in line with where we were back in that time frame. Although just to put just even a little bit more emphasis on that, the next slide shows the same information for the planted acres, except we throw in a little bit of an adjustment there because back in 2019, we did implement some program changes that actually impact those totals just based on the states that are included in our various estimates. And so if you look at that lighter shaded line across that whole time frame, it's apples and apples. And so you can see we truly are very much back in line with the acreage in those earlier seasons. Next, we'll take a quick look at the principal crop totals by state. And on this first map, we're going to compare with what we estimated back in March in the prospective plantings report. Just a quick reminder, the way this map and most of the others are laid out. On this case, the top number is the principal crop total for that state. The lower number is the percent change from the March prospective plantings estimates. All the states that are colored in any shade of blue are increasing from March. Any shade of red are decreasing, and the deeper the shade, the larger the change. And you can see moving across the country, obviously the decrease is kind of centered around the Corn Belt in particular, but pretty small changes. You can see less than 1% in many cases, and then some increases up into the northern plains and west to the northwest. But again, mostly minor changes across most of the growing area. Next, this map again shows the principal crop totals by state, but here we're comparing to last year. So now you have an opportunity to kind of see where those changes are occurring year over year. Again, mostly lighter shaded colors across most of the country, but we do see larger changes in states like North Dakota, which typically fluctuate more anyway. Next, we'll go ahead and start looking at the individual crops. We'll start things with corn. Just a really quick look here, just to give you a reminder of what planting progress looked like for corn this year. This is information from our weekly crop progress and condition report. The dark red line is the current season's planting progress. You can see the previous 5 seasons on there as well. Again, just as a reminder, pretty quick planting pace, generally speaking, this year. No major problems in most of the growing area, although to the north, there were some delays early on. With that all said, let's go ahead and look at the corn acreage numbers. We're now estimating 94.1 million acres were planted. That's up 2.3% or 2.1 million acres from the March intentions. It is up 6.2% from what was actually planted last year. Our first look at harvested area for grain, 86.3 million acres. That's up 9% from last season. At the bottom of the screen, you can see the top 5 states. And again, just a quick reminder, 2.49 million acres remaining to be planted when we did the survey. But again, with the weather the way it was, probably not a major issue there. Next, we'll just give a quick look here at how that 94.1 million acres compares over the recent seasons. Overall, it is the 3rd largest planted acreage since 1944. Next, we'll take a look at the corn planted area by state. And here we're going to first compare again with those estimates back in March. So here you can see, again, the changes from March to the current level here. You see the increases, the big increases in particular. You see the Dakota's up more than 5% each there, fairly sharp increase in Missouri. And moving on from there, overall though, looking across the total, this is the third largest March to June increase that we've seen in corn acreage. This next map just highlights the corn planted area by state and a comparison to last year. Again, just a quick look at how this year's acreage compares across the country with what was actually planted last year. Not too many red states on this map. Also included in the report, we have some estimates on the percent of the corn acres that were planted utilizing biotech seed. Just as we've seen in recent seasons, not much change happening there. Moving on to some comparisons with the pre-published industry expectations for corn planted. Again, the way this chart is laid out, each of those blue dots represents an individual industry member's pre-report published expectation. The red block represents the NASS estimate. And as you can see, that increase a little bit more than folks were expecting. So a little bit of a surprise with the corn number today. Next, we'll move on to soybeans. Just as I showed you for corn, just a quick look at the planting progress, even a little bit faster, really for soybeans. You can see no major problems across most of the growing area reported during planting. So with that said, we're estimating 83.5 million acres planted to soybeans. That's down 4.6% or 4 million acres from the March intentions. So now down 4.5%. Or 3.95 million acres from the previous season. Harvested area, you can see we're estimating at 82.7 million acres. That's off 4.2% year over year. Looking at the soybean acres over time, here you can see obviously the decline. This actually represents the third largest decrease from March to June for soybeans. So kind of the flip of what we saw happening with corn, which oftentimes would be what we would expect to see. Next, we'll take a quick look at the soybean acreage by state and how it compares with the March intentions. So kind of think about the corn map we showed, turn the blue states to red. That's essentially what we're seeing here, a lot of switching from soybeans, but not only into corn, but also, as you're going to see in a few moments, into some of the wheat in some cases as well, spring wheat in particular to the north. Sorry, spoiler alert, I should have warned you. And next, we'll take a look at the soybean planted acres and how they compare with last year. And again, normally I would point out the pound signs. We haven't seen a whole lot of those in these maps, but I would point out for soybeans, we are still looking at record high soybean acreage in New York. Again, for soybeans, we include estimates on the percent of the acres that were seeded using biotech seed, and much like corn, very little change from year to year. This year is no exception. If you thought corn was maybe going to be a big surprise today, here you can see, again, looking at a comparison with the pre-report published expectations, this is quite a bit lower than folks were expecting. And so this is maybe the biggest surprise in the report today, I would guess. I always like to kind of put the corn and soybean acreage together since they are obviously grown in the same area in many instances anyway, just to see what's happening with that total across the country. Again, first showing you the change from the March intentions. So you can see overall that total is down 1.1%. Combined, some of that switching going to other crops beyond just corn that came out of soybeans. We'll see those in a few moments. Here we do see some pound signs: Arizona, Idaho, Kentucky, Nevada, New York, not our major producing states, but nonetheless in some of those next tier levels, looking at record high totals for the corn and soybean combination. And again, just giving you a quick look at how the corn and soybean acreage combined compares to last year. Overall, looking at those published expectations, even combined, as I mentioned, a little bit lower than folks were expecting, again, with some of the acreage shifting to crops beyond just corn and soybeans. Next, we'll take a look at cotton. We're now estimating 11.1 million acres planted to that crop. That's down 1.5% or just 169,000 acres From the March intentions, of course, the big story there, down 19.4% from the previous season. Looking at how that compares over time, it is the lowest planted acreage since 2016. And a big part of that story, of course, is Texas. Anytime you talk about cotton, Texas typically leads the way, and you can see the 1.9% decrease in Texas. That's actually 118,000 acres. So that's a big driver behind what's happening with the acreage, not only compared to March, but here as we look to the previous year. Obviously, Texas by far the big change there. In fact, that's a 1.77 million acre decrease in Texas this year compared to last. And of course, we know the story, very dry conditions. Next, we'll look at the percent of the upland cotton acreage that was planted using biotech seed. So just a slight bump here, but again, like we've seen with the other crops, very little change happening from season to season in that area. Here's a nice change of pace as we look at the published expectations for cotton acreage. You see the red block right in the middle of the dots there, so shouldn't be any kind of surprise there today. Next, we'll move on to winter wheat. Slight adjustment on the planted area here. You can see now 37 million acres planted. That's down 1.3% or 500,000 acres from what we last published in March. Overall, those still up 11.2% year over year. Slight adjustment upward on the harvested area. Some of those rains we saw in recent times did improve the situation out there a bit. And so our abandonment up, or down, I should say, abandonment down, H2P up a little bit from what we were previously looking at. Still pretty low though. That's still very high abandonment. And I'll show you that here in the next couple of slides. So here with the spread between the lines, you really get a look at that abandonment. So we're now looking at an H2P of 69.5%, still the lowest since 1933, still the third lowest on record. And if we look at it in acreage terms, it's the largest non-harvested area since 2002. But that's better than it was. So here, just taking a quick look at how the acreage changes for planted area to winter wheat from March look. Again, mostly smaller changes across most of the country. Some of the bigger changes actually Michigan, Indiana, Virginia in terms of percentage terms. But of course, you can see in Texas down 4.5%. That's quite a few acres. And then just a quick reminder of what the winter wheat acreage situation looks like this year compared to last. Big increases across most of the growing area, again, leading to that 11.2% increase overall. If you look at the estimate and how it compares with expectations, maybe a little bit lower than some, but certainly well within the range of the expectations today. Next, we'll look at other spring wheat. This is one of the crops that picked up some of those acres that we lost earlier on in the presentation. So you can see 11.1 million acres planted. That's up 5.4% or 570,000 acres from the March intentions. Now looking at a number up 2.8% year over year. Harvested area at 10.6 million acres, up 1.5% year over year. So if we take a look at how this looks over time, obviously you can see nice to see an increase after several seasons of declining acreage for other spring wheat. And if we look at it on a state-by-state basis, first you can see the change from the March intentions, most of those increases coming in Montana and North Dakota. And similarly, on a year-by-year basis, you can see the increases, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, obviously big producing states. Down in Minnesota, though, also a large producing state for the other spring wheat. Looking at the expectations for other spring wheat, a little bit higher, or at least on the high end of the expectations there, but again, kind of offsetting with some of the lower end numbers we saw earlier on in the presentation. Durum wheat, though, you can see down sharply from the intentions, the late planting, having a much bigger impact in North Dakota on the durum than the other spring wheat. So we're looking at 1.48 million acres now, down sharply from March, 9.1% below last season. Here you can see for durum, planted areas decreased 6 of the last 7 years. So definitely a crop declining in acreage. Looking at how the numbers changed from March, again, North Dakota and Montana by far the dominant producers for durum wheat. That's what's driving the decrease from what we previously expected. And similarly, that's really what's driving the decrease year over year. Another surprise for you here with the durum wheat. You can see folks were expecting a few more acres. In fact, expecting acreage more in line with what the intentions were. But again, from what we're hearing, the delays in planting really pushing producers away from durum wheat this season. We do have quite a few other crops included in the report as well. I'll move pretty quickly through these just to keep things moving along for you. Barley, you can see up sharply year over year there. In fact, we're looking at the highest planted and harvested area for barley since 2016. Canola, another crop on the rise. You can see slight increase from March, 3% increase from last year. And that puts us at record high planted and harvested acreage for canola. Kind of interesting though, because we're looking at record highs in North Dakota and Washington, but we're looking at record lows in Kansas and Oklahoma. So of course, those are really two distinct crops. Fall seeded crop in the Kansas, Oklahoma area, no moisture in particular last fall. So a completely different story there. Chickpeas, you can see up 9.6% on both planted and harvested area. Dry edible beans are off 3.1% on the planted side, 4.5% on harvested. That's the lowest planted total since 2019. But when we look at the dry edible peas, we're actually looking at the highest planted since 2019. And of course, we know those crops tend to bounce around acreage-wise year from year. So no exception now. Moving ahead, looking at the lowest flaxseed acres since 1996, you can see down 46.8% on the planted from last season. Hay, though, we're actually looking at increases this year. Probably not a big surprise there, considering the low hay stock situation that we're in. So producers certainly looking to harvest more hay this year. For alfalfa, that's actually the first increase since 2019. So we're trying to, hopefully it looks like we'll get that trend maybe turned around this year. For other hay, it's the first increase since 2020. Actually looking at a record high other hay in Oklahoma. So folks definitely looking to increase their hay supplies this year. Looking at lentils, that's the lowest planted total since 2020, lowest harvested since 2019. And mustard seed, obviously a very small crop, but it is record high planted and harvested this season. Next, looking at oats, you can see we're down 2.8% on the planted side, 10.8% on harvested. That's the second lowest planted area on record for oats. Peanuts up 8.8% on the planted side. Actually looking at increases in all states except New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas that are southwest portion of the growing area. Potatoes, you can see expected those acres to be up about 5.3% this season. Proso millet, 10.7% more acres this year. And rapeseed, another one of those oil seeds with high acreage this year, second highest on record for rapeseed. Moving on to rice, we're looking at increases to rice in all states except for Texas, where we're actually looking at the lowest or third lowest total on record due to their water supply issues. California is actually up 87% because they finally got full water allocations after 3 years of severe drought conditions there. So overall, more than 20% increase in rice acreage this season. Looking at rye, planted area up 7.8%. Of course, that's largely a cover crop situation for rye, but it is the fourth consecutive year of increasing acreage there. So definitely seems to be more focus. Could be driven by some of those programs encouraging cover crops as in the last couple of years. Safflower, here's an oil seed that's not looking at record high levels. In fact, we're looking at the third lowest planted area on record for safflower. Fairly sharp increase in sorghum. Here's where we're picking up some more of those acres in Kansas and Texas in particular. In fact, Kansas is actually, or I'm sorry, overall, we're up 480,000 acres. Kansas is unchanged, but Texas is up 500,000 acres on their sorghum this year. So that's certainly offsetting some of the cotton decline that we saw. And that's typically what we would see in a dry year. In Texas, Sugar beets, you can see a little bit of an adjustment up from what we previously expected, but still down 2.7% on the planted area there. That's the lowest sugar beet acreage since 2018. Sugar cane, here you can see we're looking at harvested area at 922,000 acres. That's down almost 1% from March, or from last season, I'm sorry. Texas is looking at their lowest harvested area since 1973 for the sugar cane. Sunflower acreage off fairly sharply. In fact, we're looking at the third smallest sunflower planted area since 1976. And tobacco, last but not least, for the acreage portion, you can see down 1.9% from March, 4.2% from last year, second lowest tobacco acreage on record. So what does it all look like when we put it together? Just to kind of sum up the acreage situation first, I got just a few charts here to hopefully demonstrate that. First off here, you can just see the 22 major crops that make up our principal crop total, sorted from largest acreage to smallest. So this is literally just the acreage, planted acreage for this season. You can see corn, soybeans, hay, winter wheat leading the charge there. This next chart, I think, is probably what I find the most interesting this year. This is probably might be your go-to chart for what's happening this season, right? This literally shows the acreage change from March. You see the largest increases on the top, sorted all the way down to the largest decrease on the bottom. And so we think about that corn and soybean switching, but in between, you can see where those other acreages are all shaking out to put us at that level slightly up from what we saw in March. Next couple of charts compare back to last year. So here on a percentage basis, you can see the largest increases from last year at the top, scaling down to the largest decreases at the bottom. Or if you prefer to see that in acreage terms, the next chart will show you the same thing again in acreage terms, comparing back to last year. So with that said, we're going to transition over to stocks. We'll start things off with wheat. June, all wheat stocks, of course, for wheat and our other small grains. June is ending stocks for these crops. So ending stocks for all wheat at 580 million bushels, down 16.9% from the same time a year earlier. The on-farm stocks actually up 33.8% year over year, but the off-farm stocks down 24.7%. From what we saw a year earlier. This next graphic really gives you a nice visual of what's happening with the crop over time. And of course, this season, the way this graphic is laid out, each vertical bar represents the beginning supply for each crop season. Those four horizontal lines represent the 4 quarterly stocks estimates that we make throughout the season. And of course, this being ending stocks, that would be the gold line at the bottom. Looking at our beginning supply, the 2.35 billion bushels was down 2.5 or 5.7% from a season earlier. And our March to May disappearance at 366 million bushels was up 10.6% from the same period a year earlier. Next, we'll take a quick look at how the all wheat stocks estimate compares with the published expectations. Here you can see just a little bit lower than folks were anticipating today. Next, we'll look at corn stocks. Of course, this is third quarter stocks for corn. 4.11 billion bushels stored as of June the 1st. That's down 5.6% from last June. You can see here the on-farm stocks actually up 4.7% year over year. Off-farm stocks down 15.4% year over year. Here, looking at the same chart I showed you for all wheat, you can see that beginning supply at 15.1 billion bushels was 7.4% below the previous season. And our March to May disappearance was also down from the previous year. In fact, down 3.4% from what we saw during the same period a year earlier. Much like the expectations for all wheat, you can see folks were expecting a little bit higher corn stocks number today as well. So maybe a little bit of a surprise there, but certainly in that range of expectations. Next, we'll look at soybeans. You can see 796 million bushels stored as of June the 1st. That's down 17.8% from a year earlier. Here the on-farm stocks down 2.6%, off-farm stocks down 25.7%. Year over year, of course, for soybeans, we've seen some pretty high crush numbers, as well as that lower beginning supply, obviously leading to some sharply lower stocks here, as is evident on this next graphic. In fact, looking at that beginning supply, 4.55 billion bushels was actually 3.6% below a year earlier. And our March to May disappearance was at 891 million bushels. It doesn't look like a big surprise on the soybean stock number today. Here you can see the red block pretty much in the middle of those expectations. We did also have a rice stocks report released today as well. Here you can see the total rice stocks down 22.6% from a year earlier. Pretty comparable decline in both the on and the off farm portion of that crop. And as we look at it over time, you can see 193 million hundredweight was our beginning supply, off pretty sharply due to lower production. Our disappearance at 32.7 million hundredweight, down just slightly from 34.5 million the same time a year earlier. Just to wrap things up, we've got a few other crops included in the grain stocks report today. You can see barley stocks up sharply, actually rebounding from record low levels last year, but still the third lowest total on record. Canola, you can see the total stocks there up pretty sharply as well. In fact, that's the second highest total on record for canola stocks. But we'll offset that with the chickpea stocks. You can see they're down pretty low at the, in fact, lowest level since 2018. Dry edible peas up 25.6% in total year over year. Huge increase in the flaxseed stocks. You can see there that's really due to low production last year, the previous season, I should say, which caused lower stocks. This is probably more a normal level than we saw last year. Lentil stocks, not much change there, just down 2.3% year over year, but it does put it at the lowest level since 2016. Oat stocks, no major story there. Rice stocks, you can see up pretty sharply, but as I mentioned before, pretty small crop in terms of grain, mostly a cover crop. Sorghum stocks, you can see we're down pretty sharply from last year, but of course we had lower production, so that's leading to lower stocks. And then last but not least, the durum wheat stocks, 28 million bushels there. You can see up 18.1%. Again, that's probably more of a return to a normal level following some low stocks prior to that. Just a couple of other slides quickly before we wrap up here. You can see some of the upcoming reports over the next month. Of course, we've got our monthly care reports coming out on Monday. We're looking forward to the next crop production report on July 12th. Cattle and cattle on feed, Seth. I know you love that report. July 21st, make sure you circle that one. And then at the end of July on the 28th, ag prices and our farm production expenditures report. Last thing I will mention specifically is here shortly, very shortly this afternoon. As usual, I'll be on Twitter, but we're going to do things a little bit differently this month. So instead of just doing regular stat chat, we're going to do a Twitter Spaces. And so we'll be able to exchange audio back and forth. And so I thought, why not? You know, we don't have any surprises in the report, so it seemed like a good time, right? So it should be interesting, right? But no, we definitely want to be responsive and provide any answers to questions folks have got out there. And so we think that'll be a great opportunity for some exchange on anything that folks want to talk about. So that is the last slide that I have. So I'd like to thank everybody that tuned in on our live stream today. We're going to actually wrap that portion of the briefing up. And so thanks again for coming. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.